Good evening. Welcome to the last lecture of the fall. This is our Christmas lecture, I guess. So it's my pleasure to introduce tonight Barbara Bestor, which is an alum of SCI-Arc, architect, teacher, practitioner, she has been building a remarkable practice and a remarkable career. There are many, many ways and many angles to how her work maybe can be defined or talk about it. But the one I thought today to give some frame of reference is probably one that I think is my read, or what has been my reading for years, what I would call the LA or Southern California or design culture, which to me was not an easy road to access since my modernist hardcore education in Argentina was really, we ignored this part for the longest time. So this has been a more recent discovery. My recent means 25 years and counting, which is almost amount to half of my life. So it's not really that recent, but it's not really that long like any other bodies of knowledge that I may have in relation to architecture, and this has been fueled for friends and colleagues here over the years. And one of the things that always struck me, and I think Barbara's work in a strange way fit with certain categories, which I always find interesting about it, was what I always call the mutation or misunderstanding that Los Angeles did and appropriate of other architecture design cultures, even when it was perpetrated by the same authors. Like somebody like Richard Neutra will take some of the rules of modernism, but the beams will go a little bit farther, and the beams will be wood and not steel or not concrete, and they will have more open spaces because the LA weather would allow it. So eventually, there are all these series of mutations of what a British artist tried to develop a sensibility in California. The thing started to become not so gloomy and became happy and so on, but at the same time, it's a completely misreading and another forms of desolation and some kind of unhappiness that any British carry with themselves one way or another. But ultimately, what I think with Barbara's work is start to also deal with it, which I think is another very interesting thing, is the reappropriation of familiarity, of the reappropriation of the day-by-day things, like even the photographies of Ed Ruscha or many other artists that have been trying to operate with that, which I think is a very distinct quality that it belongs in a particular way to what I would call the LA culture. And what I mean by that is it's a way to be not local, not global at the same time. It becomes a much more like a universal language can start to operate and how we reappropriate things that sometimes operate in a different territory. And I don't want to give away any of her lecture. I will let her to talk about her work. But with the Music Conservatory in Silver Lake, to me, some of these things start to get in display. So at the end, if you start to scratch and you start to look deep, there is a high level of strangeness and weirdness in the work that it may not come across in your face, like some of the other cases. So it's a little bit what I was saying about the Richard Neutra version of LA modernism. At first glance, it may look like things that you think you understand, and you're familiar, but when you start to look close, you'll see there is a lot of mutations and transformations, and if you start to become a little bit uncomfortable, but in a friendly way. So there is something really peculiar, which I think is a trademark of certain kind of thinker, or certain kind of designers, or certain kind of artists that operate in this very particular culture. And I like to think that Barbara represents some of the best in that tradition, but at the same time, I think some of the most recent work start to also negotiate with a lot of other very contemporary conditions, which I think it makes the work even more promising and exciting. So I think it's a great time to have Barbara back at SCI-Arc, which I like to think is one of his home places, and to see what really are the next phases of this. So please join me to welcome Barbara Bestor.
Well, who doesn't like being on a screen with Hockney and Ruscha as your intro? That's pretty exciting. Gary. I am, thrilled to be here. I feel bad for those of you who are students because I know it's finals week next week, and that must suck, but I'm stressed out too, so I have empathy. So I wanted to start by showing our office. This is our current office that we moved into just about a month ago. And it's one of a series of offices that we've had that are always a storefront condition. And weirdly, almost all of them are on this same boulevard, which kind of extends through Silver Lake and Atwater Village. Also on this boulevard are Michael Maltzson, Gregory Ames' old studio, Michael Lehrer, probably about 10 more architects. And it's kind of funny because there is this neighborhood of architects on the east side that I feel like we've really sort of established a community. I'm just kind of showing you the sort of insides as you walk into my office. There is a kind of indoor-outdoor thing that and a kind of a workspace that actually, when I saw these pictures, I wanted to show them because they remind me of some of the places I worked in when I first came to LA, like in the late 80s, which were more on the west side, like big warehouses, like where I think Morphosis on Stoner Avenue and a couple of the other different firms. And I was kind of excited that, now that I'm 50, I got my own sort of wood warehouse. But the big thing in this office, and the reason that we sort of went to town spending money on this thing, aside from the 20-year lease, was that we could kind of create a community space in it that's a cafe, it's a kitchen, it's a kind of almost domestic zone for the people that are working there who are working a lot of hours. And that is something that we see kind of in a lot, well, we try to do in a lot of our projects, is how do you create community in and through architecture. This is the community of architects I actually work with, who are a wonderful group of people, many graduates from here as well. And what I wanted to kind of frame this talk with was this quote. I was talking to Joe Day earlier. We were doing an interview and reminiscing about the 90s and the kind of critical thinking about architecture. One thing that I think for my work, as someone who has toggled between academia and practice, but often in a very different way, like what the academic work is and what the office work is kind of distinct, is that I think I've become very interested in popular culture and mass culture and different kinds of communication media, and I find that an incredible source of not just inspiration, but ways of connecting with people, ways of engaging communities. And I kind of liked this quote from Margaret Crawford, who taught here when I was here as a student, in terms of like strategies for kind of revitalizing let's say the higher level kind of aesthetic discourse that we are all trained in as architects. I guess my real goal is to encourage everybody coming out of here to say, like, well, why did we give away, interior design or graphic design or branding or urban planning and urban design, that I'm kind of pushing for a kind of more, let's say, this kind of Bauhaus thing of the architect who can actually really design stuff, because I think we're all trained to be designers that are very useful in many different places, not just, say, kind of only the high. Anyhow, to be continued, let's see here. So along those lines, this building is the Unabomber shed when it was in the FBI warehouse in 1998, and Richard Barnes, who's a great photographer, took these images of it. And I had it sort of in my mind for a while as this incredibly powerful architectural image. It wasn't anything like the kind of architectural images me or my colleagues were producing, but because of its kind of status as, the home of domestic terrorism, or the really graphic idea of the individual isolated from society, without community, I just had always found it a very striking image. And weirdly, like a year or two later, I had this sad thing. I had a big divorce, unexpected divorce. I was kind of freaked out. I moved back to LA. I needed to get a house, but I was, let's say, not super rational. And I saw this place, and I thought, like, oh, that's perfect. Like, I'm gonna essentially remodel the Unabomber house and create my dream house for me and my daughters. And that is actually like so let's say that would be acting more out of instinct than reason. I was doing all these studies, like, I'm just gonna wrap it all in mirror glass and storefront and make it sort of an object of dereliction, inside. And then in the end, I did something a little more normative, but very different than what I'd been working on before that, with this kind of symmetry, and again, using the storefront materials. And it weirdly became a very popular house. I couldn't get it into Dwell at the time because there was no way you could have anything in Dwell that didn't have a flat roof. Like, there was like no gables allowed anywhere. Like, this is 15 years ago, but like absolutely not allowed. But it got into some other stuff, and on the inside, I got to do all these experiments. Like, I had these daughters. They were suddenly wanting everything to be pink. I hated pink. I only liked black and navy. I was like, okay, fine. This is your house too. So I kind of got into all this stuff that I really had not been into, and accessed some of the influences from my childhood, frankly. But also in design-wise, I was sort of designing for a different community suddenly, not the nuclear family so much, but a kind of community of like small children and groups of friends. And I got really into sort of the circulation of the house and designing a sort of crazy eight that kids literally would sort of tricycle through the house and in and out through the outdoor rooms. And similarly, at a party with a lot of people, I could kind of have this. I could have a space that would really accommodate a lot of people and still be a home, at other times. It led to a book project, which became a portrait of a community, specifically sort of Silver Lake, that I had, spent all my time in to that date. This is like around 2006, this book. But I worked in collaboration with people like Jeff McFettridge, who did these illustrations, and Michael Worthington to design it. But what I was interested in was showing how 21st century people lived in experimental architecture of the 20th century. And in particular, again, this is sort of against, it's sort of rather than the coffee table, Swiss modern, flat shots, to kind of show how people really live and stuff, and also really to bring back to light, I would say, the repressed history of super eccentric 20th century, like Schindler houses they don't follow any, there's very different than, a kind of Miesian tower. And I think it was really fun for me to kind of include, friends and family like COA, or also faculty here, people living in a Neutra house with a little kid, different kinds of things, also different kind of design thing. And again, sort of describing this community based on both a geographic place with its own topography, but also some shared values in terms of Bohemian life. After that, and until now, I have done quite a lot of houses. I'm just gonna kind of clump them together because in a way that I want to talk about some other stuff, but I would say I've done houses that cost $200,000 and houses that cost like $8 million, and it's kind of, and everything in between. One of the reasons I love doing houses is because I am somewhat devoted to that 20th century history of experimental architecture in LA being essentially the realm of the single family residence. So I think it's a great scale to experiment on with materials and spatial organization. It's also a fun place to kind of get a lot of your value out of more graphic and material sort of moments. And so, we have a lot of fun with this kind of thing. Here are some other houses that we've been doing, more money, more coastal communities. But throughout it, there's a certain attention to context. There's a certain amount of kind of a through tale that also goes into the commercial, which is really using anything you can get your hands on that you can afford to put in. It's over the tile. I mean, if all you can do is a couple of surfaces, you can still create a lot of atmosphere. You can create a sense of specific place, of culture, of community, and so these are a variety of restaurants and things. But I'd like to kind of address some of the larger scale stuff we've been doing more lately, and I think the Blackbirds Project is a great one to talk about because it is so much about designing community. I was able to take some of the things I'd learned from doing residential work and explore this hillside location in Echo Park, a very complicated topography. What was going on at the time was the developers had bought this thing that had been already entitled for like a podium with like 30 apartments, like a big box, and they wanted to try and do something that was gonna meet with less neighborhood resistance, but also kind of be a legacy project for them. And so my job was to try and figure out how to make something that had a pretty high density fit into this area. And part of it was this massing study. I mean, this is an early on thing, but looking at kind of the massing of the houses in this sort of hilly part of Echo Park. And I think strategically, we had a kind of a clear if the original lots were the left, the typical small lot project at that point was more of a kind of railroad or double-loaded corridor, 3-story things, cars on each side. And our idea, or my idea, was to change this and exploit some of the loopholes. There was a loophole where you didn't really have to have covered parking. So I was able to take a lot of the outdoor space and attribute it to parking without building more mass. And then also this sort of stealth density idea was combining groups of houses into shapes, larger shapes that were not actually one house. They might be 2 houses or they might be 3 houses. So you can kind of see how they play out on the site. Here's how we're kind of addressing the topography and an aerial of that same view in Echo Park. But in this cutaway drawing, you can kind of see more where the dividing lines are from house to house. One of the nice aspects of building this complex, almost, let's say, picturesque roofscape, was that the ceilings, each individual house really did have an individual character, often given by the ceiling scape, which doesn't really cost us anymore because we're still sort of building pretty standard units. But you had different sources of indirect light. It really changed the character a lot. And this diagram sort of shows how 3 houses, their outer shape looks like 2. So here's kind of like a picture of that lately where that sort of shows the dividing line of the different groups. And on the interior, this would be sort of one of those lifted up ceilings, the top of a staircase. There's always a skylight there. One of the bedrooms. Another feature for the inside-outside was using storefront systems, so it was very open kind of feeling from all the different rooms and views. And then, I guess more importantly, as a neighborhood, I mean, it's sort of part of a neighborhood, but that the houses they all shared a common thing, which is they all look into this common parking lot. Let's say it's called a living street. It's a sort of idea from Holland and from Japan, where when the cars are away during the day, it could have a different function. It's heavily landscaped, but they also often had a street front and have their own sort of front yard as well. These are some of the houses as they face onto Vestal Street. This is on the lower side, looking up. You can see roof decks and yards, kind of maximum, getting every inch we could, to go back to the residences. And this is looking down at that common parking court. I think the section kind of shows what amount of hijinks we had to go to in terms of the site work to get this to work, where some of the units are really built down, so their kitchen windows that go into the parking lot are actually half submerged, but it still means that there's this visual kind of neighborliness between the different structures. And this is kind of the place at a given time of day. One of my favorite things that happened, which I consider the proof in the pudding, is that the neighbors started having these collective dinner parties in that big court. And I got invited to one, although I didn't bring a real photographer, unfortunately. But so, excuse the blurs. But they actually all got together and had this giant potluck, and it was just so exciting. I was like, yes, we did it. This is a view of the units at night from Vestal. So you kind of get a sense that they read. Some of those are single family, some of them are groups. But I love it that there's a kind of, let's just say the neighborhood was happy with the how it sort of fit in. On another kind of version of dealing with, say, less important stuff, not the opera house, not the art museum, is that how you get people to engage with architecture in daily life does require some strategic, slightly theatrical activity. So for me, I've done a bunch of retail stuff, but I think the Intelligentsia is a great example because it often gets voted as a important urban public space. It is literally a coffee shop, but it does do a lot of stuff in an area that didn't have a way to gather before. It's set way back. The storefront got pushed back 20 feet to create all this outdoor seating, and then it spills out even further to the street. And largely it's tied together by this very simple idea of a very graphic tile that kind of runs from the street up and in it and is almost evocative of Istanbul or Havana or something like that, that has a kind of a ambiguity as to how old it is. That was sort of my goal in doing this. I didn't want to do a shock of the new, or chain, kind of generic thing. It was really meant to feel like a place that might still be there. Like I like sort of Café Jetain or something like that in New York, like places that you just want to go back when you go to that place. And this is at the birth of crazy barista culture. So like this was the place of that sort of, the barista as the voyeur. We designed the counters totally differently than had been done before. It became like a little bit of public theater, and it has this whole ongoing life, in Instagram or whatever as, I was in Silver Lake, here's my picture. But the picture, but these, this kind of informal living outside, and like different people, different walks of life. I guess the well-known like Jürgen Habermas thing about how coffee houses in England were like the center of, like that's what created public life that was independent from like politics that were run by the state or kind of the private family realm. Like there's a sort of somewhere to go that is a place outside of your house where you can kind of actually meet people. And for me, the big thing today is how do you do that in a way that is the atmosphere and the mixture is compelling enough to get people to put down their fucking phones. That is, like architecture has to work harder to get people off the phone. And so whenever I see a place where people are actually doing something other than being on their phone, I think that's successful. And I feel like, you have to kind of amp it up a little bit. It doesn't work as well, frankly, I think, with minimalism because unless, it's just so strong, it's harder to create that level of stimulated individual. So this is just what that building looks like. So here, another project that's literally down the road that we did just a year or so ago is the Silver Lake Conservatory of Music. It was a small storefront in Silver Lake started by Flea and a couple other musicians, Flea of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and a lot of those guys had started out learning music in free music education programs in their public schools, and a lot of them felt that it sort of saved their life, like they would have just been on the street practically. And as things like Prop 13 kind of ravaged California public education, they decided that their version of philanthropy was to start creating a way of getting music lessons, including like rock lessons to kids at a kind of sliding scale rate. So it was a very successful nonprofit, and they were finally looking for a new place. And we had the great luck to get to work on this building. So this is on Hollywood Boulevard, kind of on the edge of Hollywood, East Hollywood. And it's a old warehouse, 1930s warehouse that as this place had grown, suddenly had a couple of different major users. It had the children and their parents, but children taking music lessons. It had all these musicians. One of the people that run this school and teach there are all musicians of different levels of success or activity. So it had always functioned a bit as a communal kind of musicians' place in the city, and then also events. One of the goals of getting a bigger building was to be able to do assemblies, parties, fundraisers, but really a lot of performances. There's several large choruses. So we were trying to like overlap all these things with, including all the sort of traffic issues you have to deal with, like when you have a lot of kids, going into lesson rooms. But first we started with the street front and kind of redid that to bring it back a little bit to the traditional Hollywood street front. It was something that Flea was really interested in. There's a lot of beautiful older buildings there, but we didn't have the high quality building with the little white glazed tiles and stuff. So we sort of decided to do it as a graphic measure. We painted on a kind of a layer of graphic that was sort of spoke to that, but also marked it as new. So that kind of piece that's painted around the doors. We also added like large wood windows that open to the lobby. The lobby itself is sort of the musician's lounge. This part of it is often like quite crowded with people hanging out. There's a little store for guitar strings and stuff, and there's also a registration desk for the kids and their parents coming in. When you go in there though, then once you get past the lobby, there's this kind of almost village of lesson rooms that are for the kids for their individual lessons. They are, the kid will like kind of go down this hallway, and it's the volumes are intentionally kind of canted to give that sense of like a little town that's been scaled down a little bit for a children's point of view. The different lesson rooms inside of it are are varied. Each of the teachers kind of owns their own room, so they get to inhabit them as they will. And you have this kind of nice culture where, like, on any given hour, there's, you know, I think there's 15 lessons total, so a different student next to another student is taking a different lesson. There's a bigger drum room. And this picture that Hernan showed, so in the middle of all that, to kind of help organize that street, is this big volume that I call sort of the disco ball. It's really just a large bathroom block that we needed in order to accommodate the assembly. And rather than like banishing the bathrooms to kind of the edge, we decided it was such a big program to use it as a way of refracting light around the space. So there's a set of skylights above, and this reflective, it's just reflective mylar vinyl, but it allows this kind of light to kind of move around in there in a sort of a mute form, but employing the language, I guess, of razzle dazzle and the like. And then beyond that is the performance space, which has a big mezzanine where the chorus meets. Different kinds of groups are meeting inside this large room. This also opens out to the parking lot, so there's continuity if there's a big event that kind of spills out to the parking lot. And that is the opening night when we had the opening day rather, but kind of shows our constituents in this. When they did this, they now are able to offer like 50% of their lessons are free to kids on scholarship, and the other 50% are, you know, paying a fair amount as they can afford. So another group, other than the kids of Silver Lake, would be a group called GPAC, which is the Griffith Park Adult Community Club. And it is a group largely of seniors who currently occupy a set of trailers off of a parking lot in a recreation area on Riverside and Los Feliz Boulevard. This image is from a workshop that we did getting input on this project. But this is the actual set of trailers. What's remarkable about this, and this is such a great like LA civic lesson, is that it exists largely because I think Stephanie Vendig and some other people who are here today convinced Tom LeBonge, who was then the city council person, to get the trailers that were left over when they were restoring the Griffith Park Observatory. There was like 4 construction trailers. They just took those when they were done with them and moved them over here, and suddenly they had a rec center. So that's what this group has lived in, and since it started, they now have 800 members. They kind of have pull from about 5 different neighborhoods. And so we're working with them on a project across the street where there was this kind of cool Pereira building that burned down in the 80s, and since nothing has happened. But it seems like a good time given the kind of growing awareness of like the aging of the population, the emphasis on trying to make places where people can age in place to really get this community center kind of at another level. So we've been working on a speculative project with them, which is a project that kind of creates the front of this building as sort of a front porch along Riverside Drive, and then on the inside is a multi-purpose room kind of like this that can be a daytime use for the GPAC group, but also can revert to being a theater, which was at the original building that burned down was originally. And there's a dining hall for the people who are kind of doing the warm lunch program. There's a library / movie taping place. But we're very excited because this is sort of our big, pro bono effort, but it's also kind of exciting to see how the political side of this works, pushing something through. This site is the edge of Baldwin Hills, and there's Bologna Creek there. And what looks kind of like a fairyland is actually the Hayden Tract. So before the Hayden Tract was industrial, it had been the back lot of the movie studio adjacent to it. And we were lucky enough to work kind of at the very end of, I guess, kitty corner from Eric Moss's office, at the end of like the long drag where there's so many of his cool buildings, on a project in a former typewriter warehouse, 2-story typewriter warehouse for the headquarters for Beats by Dre, the headphones company. We'd done some work with them over the years, and they finally got this sort of permanent home building. And our job was to make this habitable in less than a year for about 600 employees, and it was a unfinished warehouse. So one of the things that we were doing was we cut some big pieces out of it and brought in a lot of daylight, and then had to navigate just a hilarious amount of existing columns, which you can kind of see in this drawing, that you couldn't touch. Like in around Ballona Creek, it's just the ground is such crap that if you remove a column, you're stuck with like an 80-foot caisson, and like there goes your budget, you know. So we're like, okay, leave all the columns, work around it. So we have sort of this main drag with these courtyards, and then we have our hilarious columns that we work with. So within that, we start, I'll just sort of walk you through it. The lobby, which is sort of the public lobby with the valet parking, et cetera, is a little kind of gathering space. You see the columns decorated with the Beats red cords. And it's part of the end of this main drag that is really the main public communal space, and they use it also for big meetings. But we wanted to do sort of a museum quality steer here and kind of celebrate the publicness of this bigger area as opposed to the workspaces. On the left is a stainless mirror glass wall that hides the boardroom. And this main drag also features this cafe, which is sort of at the other end, which is where the employee parking lot is. And so most people are coming in for the day, coming from that end. And so this cafe provides a kind of impromptu meeting place for everybody. Really, again, thinking of this as a kind of urban design project, and how do you create sort of quality places where people can gather or cross paths, and the bathrooms are right down this alley as well, so everything's sort of tied together. But then the two big defining architectural spaces would be these courtyards. This blue one is tailored for the operations department, who are the people who are up all night directing large carrier ships from, one part of Southeast Asia to Australia or something like that, and literally asked for kind of a place of calm repose. They wanted almost like the program for like a Swedish library, kind of like somewhere to just be quiet, and they're on the phone with whoever all the time. Whereas on the other side, I'll show you another picture. There was the courtyard was the marketing department. They have a different attitude, I'll say. So within that, the organizational space is big open courtyard, and then all meeting rooms around that act almost like kind of a village of spaces where you can see across the courtyard. But these are all just meeting rooms, not private offices. And in between pieces are these kind of carved out bits that this is sort of connecting one courtyard to the main group, but these are these sort of impromptu moments, largely dictated by those columns, but trying to always use it as an excuse to like explore poche cutouts or create like a little hangout. This became one of the big selfie spots. But this kind of little connector, then you see the cafe and you see the blue courtyard beyond. So there's kind of nice visual corridors through. This is the marketing guy's courtyard, who are like, we just want an art school, we want whiteboards everywhere, concrete floors, a lot of no doors. So even though the spaces are very similar, they become kind of different atmospheres. And another thing when you're dealing with like 600 people is different, like a lot of people might not want to walk down a really big public stair and a grand, kind of walk through. So parallel to that large opening is a little tiny stair that gives a direct route to the coffee shop for the person who may not want to just see everybody. And that has its own kind of material space. So we were trying to really like take seriously the critiques of open offices and build different kinds of spaces for different kinds of people into it. We designed a whole palette or vocabulary of wallpapers and graphics that are part of the wayfinding system. So there's quadrants, there's blue, green, gray, et cetera, are different quadrants that are grouped together. One of the ways that plays out is these kind of big graphic wallpapers. This is the fancy part, so we made it silver and gold. But that's sort of there's a back staircase for celebrities that are coming up to see one of like Jimmy Iovine or something. There's a kind of it's slightly lighthearted. These are some of the private offices that are on the fancier side, but again, these custom graphics. But I think one of the more interesting things that goes across it is a whole nother layer of visual two-dimensional work, which is a series of photographs that we commissioned from E1 Bond to shoot LA from different like non-traditional viewpoints. So aerial shots of the docks, of Baldwin Hills, of the place where Dre grew up, the place where Jimmy lives, like just sort of different shots, and that we use those often in rooms in a way to kind of keep reminding everybody this is in LA, like this is a kind of a rooted company. It wasn't, we were trying to combat a lot of the global genericism that is popular in that tech business. So like, for instance, this interchange becomes, dominates one of the engineering bays. And I always like this picture. We use this as the whiteboard in the conference room. It's not smog, it's marine layer, but it's this kind of white layer of LA that is kind of fun because when you write on it, you still get the city peeking through. So along those lines, we've been doing a lot of work with tech companies. Generally, that's all secret, so can't really show most of that. But here are some ideas. These are some of the ways that we do that, like how we're kind of thinking when we're working on an office project. So this set of examples are a proposal we did that was not built, but for a existing kind of box, let's say a mirror glass box in an industrial park, and trying to create a different interior, like leave the outside alone, but on the inside change it radically. So turning the atrium, the open atrium into an enclosed space, breaking up some of the floor plates, creating a tunnel entrance that's really separate from the kind of general trope of 80s cheap industrial park. And I just think these drawings are kind of fun because it's sort of where, it's one of the places where we kind of look at the atmosphere and see if we can kind of get buy-in from the people that we're working with on, how we might think about their space. I'll just run through this. And another one that along those lines, another speculative project was for a company taking an existing warehouse that they wanted to turn into a condensed movie studio. So an entire film studio production and music production thing would get sort of condensed into one floor. And then we proposed that we would then kind of lift above it the kind of people space so that you would sort of go down into the part that you were working on. The section kind of describes it. So the super studio part was the bottom floor, which has a variety of stages and so on. But then there's one double height kind of performance space. And then the upper level is more a kind of social space, akin to something like this, like a Soho House kind of space. So you sort of pop down. It's almost like one of the sort of 60s ideas about cities. But anyhow, this is that theater space. This is the exterior. That's the bottom's existing. The new part would be lifted independently. And then cut to a different topic. So exploring all that technology or doing all this work at scale for technology companies, we have had the great pleasure of working on this house that is probably the most high-tech house in LA in a way, even today. And it's Lautner's house. It's called Silvertop. It's kind of the falling water of Los Angeles. One of my clients from the tech world bought it, and we did the restoration, but also a lot of what we did was a hidden layer of new technology, lighting. We restored or recreated systems that had never actually worked originally in the project. And this is a floor plan of it. It's a house that is characterized by a couple of big moves. These two curving walls that frame a glass zone that stretches. On one side, there's a view of the ocean. On the other side, the mountains. And it's very clearly organized, for this sort of maximum natural, the illusion that you're just sort of in this cathedral space. There's an 80-foot, 5-inch thick pre-stressed concrete wall roof over the whole thing, which was super cutting edge technology at the time. This is done in the late 50s. Here's some of the technology. So this is when they poured the roof, I think it's 162 tons of concrete, and there was no way that trucks could get there, so they built a huge crane, and they were bringing it in bucket by bucket over like a 24-hour period to get this pour right. the architect Lautner and his client, who was a technologist, he had invented a kind of aluminum clip system in World War II. They went and visited Alto's work in the 60s. They went to see Felix Candela and Nervi, and they really wanted to just kind of be completely state-of-the-art with the technology in this house. The building of the driveway itself is a cantilevered, it's kind of a bridge, but it's a cantilever that goes from a foot to 3 inches at the outside, and it's all anchored in a round building that became the guest house. So I guess what I find so interesting is that it's a super voluptuous house, and in part it's because there was a real embrace of the language of infrastructure. You know, the only thing you see like this around LA more is sort of freeway overchanges and stuff, and that this is kind of puts it in almost in a whole nother category than some of the other descendants of Frank Lloyd Wright, in that it, you know, the amount of material and constructional technology is a whole new world. So one of the things that we did, and let's say we are now in an era of less dramatic but kind of human interfacing technology, we created a whole system of switching with a graphic language that we developed with Jeff McFettridge that is hiding, like it's an analog interface, but it hides a pretty massive computer frame in the underneath the house. And so all the lighting, sound, et cetera, is run off of this. This is like an image of that alphabet that we came up with. So it's kind of hard to remember when you don't live there, you know, but it's kind of fun. It's a pretty good catalog. Oh, here's a video. This is good, I think. These are some of the moving parts. Some of them are our new ones. Like we did this ridiculous like glass wall. You get the idea. That was, let's see. In the main living room, this is where I was talking about, like there's glass on each side, and it really is just kind of cradled by this roof expanse, and the views are remarkable. Jamie Bush did the furniture on there. That was really hard to do, but the brick walls, which I do think are incredibly reminiscent of Alto, and there's like some really nice kind of direct homages in here, in the kind of collaging of different architectural influences. We had the great fortune of the house was never finished. In '64, it went on hold. Reiner ran out of money, not because of the house, but he did, and so it became essentially abandoned and looted and pillaged to some degree. In the early 70s, a couple bought it who were total sweethearts, but they didn't have a lot of money to do bigger things, so they kind of built out like a little kitchen and a couple other things to just make it livable. So our task was kind of going back to the Getty, which has the Lautner archive, going through the whole thing and looking at how we could get some of what was originally intended without, you can't really make things look like they were original. This is a tenet of architectural history, if you did not know. And so our thing was, how do we create a language that ties in but is also marked as different? So a lot of what we were doing is that our work that's newer is using the same Louisiana cypress that's throughout the house in these wood horizontal pieces, but using it vertically at a smaller scale. So you get the tonal quality of the wood. We also kind of did a language of cabinetry that is more fluid and kind of curving the way some of the concrete was, but not like the Lautner built-in parts, which are much more angular. So these are some of the parts that we were able to add into the project. This was existing, but new furniture. Amazing, all these things are motorized. A lot of these things weren't motorized, and we motorized them in case they, weren't yet. This is the piece, this glass wall goes down about 20 feet into the ground in a frame that we built, and there's also a glass skylight that's frameless that moves also. They both have their own button. That's a good button to have. These are some more images of the house, and the house features the first horizon pool in the world. This is the whole deal. Anyhow, so that was really fun and a good lesson in a lot of things. Back in the day in 2011, I think, I did one of the SCI-Arc installation gallery things here. And this project, which was called Disco Silencio, was super fun. And it ties into my whole thing about getting people off their phone, because I felt at the time I was walking around, I was like, well, how can I do an installation that's for the students? Like, I'll make the students will be my client. And I feel like everyone was so attached, like just literally plugged into their computer and 24 hours a day. I was like, you gotta have some relief. So I thought a disco, would be good. And so the idea of this place was to kind of create this place that was almost a disco without you having to do much. It was all wired with speakers that you could plug your iPhone into at any time. And like a disco, it all had sort of like this main floor, but and it was taking a polyhedron and unfolding it, which was sort of a joke about all the polyhedrons everyone was doing in 2011, but that's another story. But the back of the stage, the back of the walls, because so we have an unfolded model of a polyhedron. So there's all this leftover space, and you can kind of see that pink light. That was sort of the whole other part of it. That there was this other world that was like a quiet place. There was like little beds and ladders and kind of hangouty spaces, and there that again were places of refuge for that student who may not want to go on the floor, but might want a break from their computer. So that was kind of fun. And then in terms of exhibits lately, or maybe after that, I sort of got more interested in curating, and part of it was this, the kerfuffle around Denise Scott Brown, not getting the Pritzker. There was some really great articles written about it, and one of them was about the lack of women designers from the 20th century in Wikipedia. And it was sort of, maybe it's Wikipedia trolls, but it was also true that unless your work is getting seen again, you may not exist in the digital age, because no one's going out and like scanning every issue of, the Cincinnati Herald. So I thought, well, that's I think I looked up Deborah Sussman, because I was thinking about her work again, and no Wikipedia page. Her husband, Paul, is actually here too, but I was shocked. I was like, but Deborah Sussman is a big deal. Had been very influenced by her over the years. And so I decided to do a show about her and kind of coerced a couple other architects and historians into it. And we got to do this really great show about Deborah and her work. And one of the things about community that you find out from talking to people who have been here for a while. So Deborah, came out to work for the Eameses, shared a studio space with Judy Chicago, Jerry Kavanaugh, Frank Gehry, and Don Cheswick, the Aeron chair guy. There was just these communities in LA this would have been like the 70s and 80s. Even the Olympics project, which I find incredible, is this John Jurdy, Deborah Sussman, and a team of people getting together collaboratively to kind of make something happen. So I do feel like the architecture culture that we think of is often really coming out of these communities. I mean, even obviously like the Schindler House, the Neutra Schindler co-housing house. So how do we bring that back into the discourse is my question. Anyhow, so Deborah's work, kind of covered a lot of commercial stuff. Those are some of her Olympic projects at the right. We called the show Deborah Sussman Loves Los Angeles, which was a kind of an homage to the poster that she did for the Rainier Banham movie. These are some great ideas that didn't get realized for a temporary city. And the Olympics, which again, those of you who were not old enough to be there, but that created pretty much the color palette of the 80s. It was LA's biggest export at that point. This idea also of a temporal city. It's more largely made out of paper and scaffolding, very dismountable. It was very inexpensive, but maybe one of the strongest visually present Olympics ever. And I am super interested in this, you guys, because 2028 is like right around the corner. What are we architects going to do? I feel like a lot of the emphasis this year, this in 2028, is not building new stadiums, which are already well underway, and they're kind of using as is pretty much. But there's discussions of lots of streetscape, pageants and movement and the changing transportation. I just feel like it's this wonderful time for us all to kind of go like, what do we want to say about LA and its vibrancy now? This is a shameless plug for a show I helped curate about Paul Williams, photographs of his work. It's next Saturday night. But Paul Williams also in this People Not in the Record, sadly, the Paul Williams archives in his office got largely burned in the LA riots, so there isn't a whole lot of work. His work is not archived in any museum. There hasn't been a Paul Williams show ever. He won the gold medal, but like, I would say way more realtors know about Paul Williams' work than any architects do, and I feel like it might be racism, it might be how digital media works, but I thought like we could do something to kind of keep talking about Paul Williams. He was quite a polymath, going between modern and more traditional languages, but what a remarkable person. In Palm Springs, we have a show right now about Lena Bobardi and Albert Frey. I've been a huge Lena Bobardi fan for a while, but it was a kind of great opportunity to work on their thing, and Andrea Dietz, who worked on it, is here, and Henry Chung. We kind of put together, we wanted to make an architecture show that was kind of a sensorial overload, not so cut and dry. And so we looked at this palette using, these are the Lena Bobardi kind of shapes from her Sao Paulo project that are like blasted through the concrete. And these are some of the colors in her work, and these are in the Albert Frey. Albert Frey is Mr. Circles, but kind of using color from his language. And these sort of together became the language behind a series of walls and screens that are kind of helping define the space in this. It's in a glass building in Palm Springs. It's up until mid-January, but it's kind of a fun, like there's sort of a game between the Frey side and the Bobardi side. They're kind of organized along a diagonal, but I hope you guys will check it out. But I also just wanted to make sure it was, an architecture show that could kind of entrance people for different reasons. It wasn't just about looking at the plans, but also having like a spatial experience. And while in Palm Springs around the corner, we're working on another bigger project. This is it's a hotel concept based on the idea of Airbnbs, where you rent a whole house. You rent a house that's like a 5 or 6 bedroom villa. And the space inside, which obviously has some relationship to Blackbirds, there's a sort of parking and park zone that has multiple functions. The idea is you could rent the whole complex and have 90 bedrooms for a wedding or something, or a bunch of people going to Coachella could each rent things with 6 bedrooms and share them. But the real concept is that it's taking the idea of the Palm Springs villa, like the pool, the kind of indoor-outdoor space, and verticalizing it. It's located in downtown Palm Springs, so you can walk everywhere from there, and often there's a pool on the roof. But what's fun is that the politics of Airbnb in Palm Springs are complicated. It's a good chance that they're going to outlaw them because there's so many residential neighborhoods and nobody wants like 20 kids, renting the house next door to them all weekend and screaming. So we're sort of trying to go like, well, what would be a new typology? These interesting developers asked us to work on it, and this is actually starting construction soon. Language-wise, we were using much more like a more minimal kind of language of, kind of geometry and punched openings instead of, you can't have too much glass in the Palm Springs. So this is the last project I wanted to show. This is a winery called Ashes and Diamonds. It's in Napa Valley, and it just opened 2 weeks ago. And it's 2 buildings. It's a production building, which is actually kind of 2 buildings itself, and a hospitality building. And it's kind of exciting because it ties in a lot of these different ideas. The site originally is this vineyard. We're kind of like the back part off of that other parking lot. So we weren't touching any of the vineyards, but we're in this, if you like super graphics, it's kind of exciting to have your project in a vineyard with all these amazing lines. But so we were, our goal was to kind of get, what would be, and this is our client's goal too, is what would be a way of kind of getting California's own modern kind of renaissance into the language of a winery. If you've been to Napa, you have a lot of Renaissance Europe. You have ye olde something. You have a lot of modern barns, and we just thought it'd be kind of great to take a more California-specific set of tropes. So it's kind of almost a pop art thing about California modernism. We do landscape architecture as well, so we have built this landscape that's intentionally sort of graphic, but has a kind of outdoor theater and mounds and took, inside the production space, this is the crush area. So this is, an indoor-outdoor space that is where a lot of the work happens. Things go into the vats, and eventually they get barreled. There's a couple different barrel rooms. They're at different temperatures. So production building is really largely large metal insulated sheds. And we just operated on the facade, the very front part, where we inserted a little bit of hospitality and made it kind of part of the front face of the building. This is inserted inside the production like a kind of VIP hospitality. But the front on the right with the fray reminiscent circles is the kind of expression out of that production building. It has an office above it. And then it kind of looks out over the garden and the other building. This is looking out from the office. The other building is really this very simple, it's almost the size of a simple, long modern house. And it features this shade structure that also allows us to do different kinds of lighting. One of the biggest issues in Napa is it's awfully hot in the summer, so there's sprinklers, there's lights, there's trying to get as much outdoor space as we can. Our footprint was very limited by the Napa authorities, and so the language, which might be from like a Wexner building in Palm Springs or something, is kind of exaggerated and separated from the building as a kind of, it's really more of like a signifier from the road. If you're driving up the Napa Highway, you really see that ridgeline. And the interiors are intentionally like a mix of kind of some of the modern classics. This is the last picture that I have. So this is sort of looking from the garden out there underneath the shade structure. That is that. Thank you.